A big problem with trying to explain history in general is coming up with an end game. What's your point in telling the story? Uh, if we look back to Greek and Roman historians, we end up with some really interesting things. Uh, to Greek and Roman historians, the truth was not at all important. Uh, their primary goal was to craft a story that created cultural cohesion and moral reinforcement of virtues that they considered to be important to their culture. Thus, we have a lot of historical figures on the Roman side who we can't honestly say we know exactly who they were. Uh, People can tell you incredibly detailed stories about uh, the famous Caligula. Yet he was a reviled figure in his time. So uh, Roman historians who are very well versed in how modern Roman historians who are well versed in how ancient Roman historians did things, are aware that a lot of what we know about him could be wholly fabricated and certainly heavily exaggerated. The greatest insult to levy on somebody in that era was insanity. So odd that all the people who were reviled somehow ended up insane at the same time. So, so something like the Iliad and the Odyssey, where we have a blending of which most likely was an actual historical event, but we actually see in the original story, we see the intervention of gods actually appearing within this story. And it's told to the Greeks and eventually the Romans as more or less historical fact. They didn't mind the idea of essentially turning a real world story into something mythological because they had a purpose. Their goal was understood from the get go. So when we start talking about U.S. history and history of Western civilization that impacts the U.S., we've had a number of schools of thought that enter into it. One of the if you're closer to my age, you would have been raised on nationalist history. And the idea of nationalist history was they tended to use omission of things that were made the country look bad in character and tended to emphasize very strongly things that looked like good national character. Because of the way this omission and emphasis occurs, a lot of this history ends up the causes of major events seem to just kind of disappear a lot of times. Now, the goal, of course, of the nationalists was very similar to what the Greeks and Romans had in mind, the idea of national cohesion and reinforcement of moral ideas that they considered virtuous for Americans. The problem is, uh, it tends to make large sections of our history boring, which causes a lot of disinterest for people. And the other problem is when you start asking the questions like, okay, just exactly how did that war start? It starts making you doubt everything else the nationalists have told you once you dig into it. So you can see what their goals were, and we can also see some of the fallout of it. Now, in general, the nationalist history carried the United States probably from its birth up until about the 1960s. And to a certain extent, very high level universities would start talking about U.S. history in a more actual and factual manner, but it was considered to be the kind of history only the biggest decision makers of the country should have access to. So the history that starts creeping in the 60s and 70s is leftist revisionist progressive history. Now, the major key to this history is that everybody gets represented, and they will contort themselves into unbelievable shapes in order to include people who just didn't have that much of an impact on history. So you would get these very awkward things where it's like, oh, well, Declaration of Independence was signed, and this was great for white men, but did very little for women and black people. It just creates this kind of awkwardness. Uh, the leftist revisionist progressives tended to look at historical oppressions, which existed obviously, but define them how the modern world would view it. So they would go into incredible great lengths to, like, instead of telling you about the Constitution or how it was formed or key ideas of the revolution, and they would talk to you about what the day of an average woman was like during that time period. And they would cast her in a role in such a way where they made it sound like she felt oppressed, or at least they made it seem to the reader that she obviously must feel oppressed when she had nothing to compare it to. So a lot of it was kind of drivel. I mean, yes, it is interesting from time to time to know how the average person is living because it lets you know how we are doing in comparison, but it's not really how the waves of history themselves flow. Uh, there was a lot of emphasis on useless minutia like this. It was okay to fabricate anecdotes. You didn't create major events, but it was okay to say things like for instance, a famous one that popped up in the 70s was somebody made up an entire history of some African American regiment or battalion liberating a concentration camp when it actually didn't happen. And once the author was busted for it, they came out and said, "Well, I was trying to bring Jews and blacks together, so it's that should be acceptable." And a lot of people came out and said, "Well, yeah, his motives were in the purest form, so that's okay." So they were okay with fabricating anecdotes. The question is what was the progressive leftist revisionist agenda? What were they trying to accomplish? It's possible it could have been a Trojan horse for Marxist historians who would follow in their path, or it could be like many, because liberals tend to get dragged along by progressives, and a lot of times liberals do things that are very well meaning, but not necessarily useful. So we move along to what I call leftist revisionist Marxist history. And this is essentially what we're seeing now. It's been creeping in since the 70s. In the 70s, it looked a little bit more benign, and as the years have gone on, it's become more and more horrific looking. It's critical for the Marxists to cast all history as a hierarchy of oppression, the greatest oppressors being white Christian males at the top, and then the various different groups that you might belong to gain you greater creds as you work your way down the oppression hierarchy. Uh, in their history, the oppressed never initiate hostility. Anything to do with Western civilization is depicted as ugly and brutal. Uh, the actors who are essentially moving Western civilization forward never have a good motive. To these guys, any fabrication is acceptable to the narrative. So it's not just small anecdotes like their predecessors would do. They're okay with just completely making something up out of whole cloth. In fact, it doesn't even have to resemble reality. As long as they get their story out first, it's going to take a long, hard slog for anybody to be able to undo that story. And their ultimate goal is to undermine uh, Western civilization, and the attack is on the historical leg that holds that part up. Now, there's some smaller ones that come up, and we see stuff like this. This is kind of the camp I fall into. People like Tom Woods and other things like that. Not insinuating that we're in the same class of history, but just pointing out that there's the idea of truth revision, where you are revising both the nationalist narrative and the progressive narrative and the Marxist narrative in order to try to explain exactly how things happened. Now, some of the problems with that, of course, is uh, a lot of people don't want to hear the truth. Sometimes the truth isn't as sexy as a good story that's been fabricated. Uh, and the truth itself doesn't particularly have any other objective but the truth. So, in some ways, truth revision uh, can have an effect of eroding uh, general societal view of things. I mean, if you point out the fact that certain certain leaders who are revered have done something horrible, or some of the things they have done weren't good, in fact were bad, it seems like you're more attacking the nationalist narrative than you are the Marxist and progressive, which can be an issue. But if truth is the only thing that's your goal, then the fallout is something you just have to deal with. Another area is what I call trivial history, and this is where people pull out this gee whiz stuff where you go, oh wow, that's kind of interesting, but it really doesn't help you understand what's going on. It's like, for example, like George Washington had wooden teeth. Well, no, he didn't. It was a mixture of the teeth that had been pulled from other people or dead people, and a mix of ivory and other things like that. And it was this horrible conglomeration of stuff and caused him excruciating pain. Blah blah blah. Okay, well, yeah, that's interesting, but it doesn't really affect history. I mean, it's not like Washington skipped a critical battle because he was in excruciating pain due to some oral infection he got from his dentures, and history was changed due to it. It's kind of irrelevant. Interesting, but irrelevant. So I wanted to throw out a quick general example and attack it from a few different directions looking at history. Columbus is a really good example. Christopher, of course. So the question comes up, why is Columbus so prominent? Okay, so we know, I mean, at the time Columbus entered into nationalist history, it was probably not well known that the Vikings had made it to America, or at least North America first. Um, and then later on, it would be known that, yes, the Vikings definitely made it to North America way before Columbus, yet it didn't alter the history at all. I mean, he gets a brief mention at best, Leif Erikson, etc. And now we're getting some indications that maybe Celts and Maybe some other Mediterranean seafaring people may have also landed in the area of the United States and Canada much earlier than even Erickson and Columbus. Yet they don't really fit into the history well at all. Not brought up. But we remain with the emphasis on Columbus. Now, if you look at it in terms of the United States, Columbus isn't really a critical figure to the history of the United States. If you were to look at who was more critical to the history of the United States, you would look at the English fishermen who made their first landings in the continental U.S. They would fish the fishing banks, come inland, dry the fish, and then bring them back to England and sell them. And this is well before any English colonies had really been set up. And the huge impact is they spread smallpox to the Indians inadvertently. And essentially, by the time English settlers arrived, uh, the various indigenous tribes were never in a position to be a major military threat to these new settlements. It essentially allowed them to get going, even when they started off incredibly small and ill-equipped to handle this. But still not much of a story. So if we look at Columbus a little bit more, I mean, I jokingly say Columbus is just some guy, because the thing that makes Columbus different than anybody else is that he kind of was first in terms of uh, the beginning of permanent settlements. But again, not as germane directly to the United States. And if you also look at the brouhaha around Columbus, okay, if Columbus hadn't shown up, sooner or later somebody else would. And in all likelihood, all the events that started with the arrival of Columbus would have started with whomever else came in his footsteps. Those people would have spread smallpox amongst the Indians. Those people would have set up settlements that would have started cultural conflicts that would have eventually erupted into war, which would have eventually turned to conquest. There was a certain inevitability of it. It just so happens that uh, Columbus made a series of in some cases, very good decisions, and in some cases, uh, horrible miscalculations about where he was going, and what he would find, which altered the course of history. But again, it's very likely that somebody else would have done the same thing if he hadn't. So, why Columbus? Well, the key to understanding Columbus in nationalist history, why does the U.S. make a big point of Columbus, even though Columbus essentially brought the Spaniards to America and not the English? Uh, really, what it is Columbus was the vanguard of Western civilization in the New World. So that's why Leif Erikson and other unknown people who arrived and made an impact on North America aren't highlighted. Very clearly, Columbus came with a number of goals under his belt. Uh, his idea of reaching the Indies was, at the time, there was an understanding that there was this great ruler of the Indies, some great Khan, who Khan, not Con, who was not Islamic and might be very well predisposed to Christianity. And one of the things Columbus hoped to do was forge this great alliance with these people, convert them to Christianity, and then create essentially a backdoor on the Islamic Empire, the Caliphate, in order to relieve some of the pressure that Western Europe was feeling from Islam. Obviously, his next major goal was to open up a trade route that would make him and everybody involved with the enterprise wildly wealthy. So, if you look at it on the surface, Columbus fits the bill of a good nationalist hero. He's a person who believes in the free market system. He's willing to take risks. One of his driving goals is Christianity. So it makes perfect sense that the nationalists would pick him, even though he doesn't have a direct impact on the United States. He is the flag bearer of Western civilization to the Western Hemisphere. So the reason why, so if you go back and kind of look at the whole thing where I threw out before, that again, everything Columbus did would have happened anyway. It just somebody else at a somewhat different time. He's not impactful to the U.S. So the Marxists go at him with incredible vigor, and it's solely because of the figure he is as the vanguard of Western civilization coming to the Western Hemisphere. To the Marxists, it's important to turn that into the worst disaster in history. So, if you're one of the people out there who are thinking Columbus is this incredibly horrible person, odds are really good the history you know about him is wrong. Essentially, Columbus has been completely transformed from who he was into a Hitler-esque figure by a Marxist historian named Howard Zinn. And Zinn just basically butchered the history, literally using secondary sources that were very not credible, using sources of people who were rivals of Columbus, and also literally cutting and pasting verbiage from Columbus's logs in order to not only make Columbus say things he did not say, make him do things he did not do. And the only purpose the Marxists have in attacking the Columbus narrative is to destroy the foundation of U.S. history in terms of how the nationalists have presented it. So those are some general overviews of some historical elements. And I'm kind of doing some thinking in terms of, is there a spin I want to put on the purpose of what I'm putting videos out for? I mean, truth revision, I think, is important because it just seems to me that knowing exactly how things happened, or at least knowing how things happened to the best of our understanding, is important. But the question is, should there be further goals beyond just the truth? And if anyone has any thoughts on that, feel free to throw that in the comment section. I'd like to hear your opinion on that. Is the truth enough? Or should it be truth and something else? Truth with a side of something. All right, please smash the like button. If there's somebody you know who might find this interesting, please consider sharing it with them. And if for some reason you come across this due to the YouTube algorithm, please consider looking at my other videos and subscribing to my channel. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.